So welcome to the Music Production Club live class. Today we are talking about subtractive synthesis. And these concepts are really useful for all of your sound design and whether you're using a sampler or whether you're using just any of the synths in live or hardware synths or even a lot of VSTs. Like a lot of these same concepts show up in all different kinds of synths. So that's kind of nice. It's just often a matter of how they're dressed up and how they're presented. But the subtractive synthesis concept is pretty much the same all the time. And I think a good way to imagine it is almost like if you have like a sculpture, if you were a sculptor and you had like a big block of granite or something that you were going to sculpt in, you're basically chipping stuff away. You're subtracting from that rock to make the sculpture. And I think even like Michelangelo was known to say like his sculptures were in there. He just had to sort of dig them out. And that's kind of what you're doing with subtractive synthesis. You start with a sound wave that's usually pretty rich in harmonics, and you start subtracting things out. You start taking out some of the frequencies with a filter. You start changing the sound, the volume of the sound over time using the envelopes. And then you start using modulators to make things move and keep things interesting. But really, it's just a very full sounding sound wave that you start sculpting and paring down into what you want. And I think if you have that sort of concept in mind, a lot of it becomes a little bit easier. You can start thinking about sounds that you're familiar with, like maybe instruments, like a snare drum, for instance, is a sound that has a very fast attack. It happens suddenly, and then it quickly decays. And you can make those shapes using your envelopes. And then, you know, with a little know-how, you can start making those sounds inside synthesizers. So I thought maybe I'd open up like a few different synths from live and just kind of show how some of this stuff is connected. But I thought I'd start with Operator. Operator is technically an FM synthesizer, which is frequency modulation. But if you have it in its default mode, well, no, I'm sorry, that's not true, not the default. If you set the algorithm here to the one all the way on the right, this makes it essentially a 4-oscillator synthesizer, and it works a lot like a subtractive synth. But the reason I kind of picked Operator for right now is to just demonstrate something about the waveforms and how they all work. So I've got right now a sine wave. And if I need to, maybe I'll just turn this down a little bit so you can still hear my voice as I'm talking. The sine wave is the most pure waveform there is. When I play this C and we look at the EQ here, this is from EQ 8, when we expand it, we get just that one fundamental frequency. It's just the most pure tone. There's no harmonics. So when I play a C, it plays only that note. This just doesn't occur in nature. Every sound is more complicated than that. It has harmonics. It has additional frequencies that the sine wave just doesn't have. It's a very difficult sound to reproduce even on an analog synthesizer because there's still some kind of frequencies and noises and little things that peek through in the circuitry. But in the digital world, we can get these pure sine waves. For this reason, because it's so pure, it's a really good sound if you're trying to make like sub basses, like really low bass, and you want to just pinpoint it to a certain frequency. Sine wave is great. I actually love Operator in its default state right out of the library as a sub bass a lot of times. So maybe before I just explain subtractive, I'll just really briefly touch on additive synthesis. So there's subtractive where you're cutting away, but there's additive synthesis, which has a longer history than subtractive synthesis, where we're adding sine waves to it. And this readout here on Operator is the harmonics and the frequencies of the sine wave. If we look at a sine wave, it's just this one tone right here. If we look at, say, a square wave, we've got more tones in here. But if we look at sine wave, I can play this note here and I get just that. But I can then draw in with this tool right here other frequencies. Let me try to keep it to 1 for now. And you know what? I'll make this a little less resolution. You can go down to 16 or 32 or 64 different harmonics here, but maybe I'll keep it at 32. And as I draw in this note, this tone, I'm adding a sine wave at this frequency. And it's changing the tonality of this sound. And this is additive synthesis because I'm adding sine wave frequencies. I can go over, put a higher one in, and this is basically volume. Bring it down a little, add a couple there, maybe. So I'm adding sine waves in here. That's additive synthesis. You can kind of see, if you pay attention to this oscilloscope right here, we got our really nice sine wave, but as I start adding in other sounds, it starts changing the waveform a little bit. It gets more complicated. Now, if I go over to, say, a saw wave, which we have in here, now all of these are filled up completely. And it produces this really buzzy sound. We get this shape for the saw wave. This has all of those harmonic series in there. Every single one of them is represented here. If we go to the square wave, it's going to look a little different. Now it's every other one, and it creates this shape. And if you look, you've got less harmonic content in our spectrum up here. This is the square. And we'll go back to the saw. A lot more of these little peaks here. And then we can go to triangle, which if we look at here, it's going to have fewer of those harmonic peaks. And it's got this shape, which really isn't that far from the sine wave. So if you remember when we were talking about 8-bit music, the triangle wave was a big part of that. Usually used for bass because it doesn't have a lot of tone to it. Then they also use the square wave quite a lot. This would be like an 8-bit. We can go to the digital one though. And if I play it like that, it kind of sounds like an old chip, you know, from a video game system. So those are really like how the waveforms are made up. They're really just complex sine waves put together to make these different shapes. Then a very common thing we have are the white noise. This is very common in synthesis too, to have a white noise generator. And that's just kind of every frequency at once. A lot of the video games also use this too to generate sound. And a lot of synthesizers will have this parameter. Maybe now I will go over to analog, and I don't think I brought this with me, but we'll put analog over here. The oscilloscope over here for analog. Now, analog is a subtractive synthesizer. It has the typical things you would see in a subtractive synthesizer. We got the oscillator, which is the sound generator. That's where the sound begins, is with the oscillator. It produces the sound wave. And here we have a few choices. We have a sine wave, which sounds like this. Nope. Sorry about that. I still have that one record enabled. This is our sine wave. We've got our saw wave. And we've got our square wave. And we've got a noise generator. All right, I'm sorry. I still have oscillator 2 on. Let me turn that off. We're just looking at oscillator 1. We get the noise. We get the square. We get the saw, that buzzy sound. And we get the sine. I thought I would just point out something kind of interesting about analog. Analog is a modeled synthesizer. So it's meant to model the circuitry of like an actual analog synth. So we can kind of see this in action. If we look at operator and I play a sine wave, that's the pure tone, one single frequency we only have that. We have nothing else. But if we do that on analog, I'll open this up again. You'll notice there's like just a little bit of stuff going on here. Maybe if I turn it up, we might see a few more pop up. You can see those little tiny peaks. That is trying to show us, or that's emulating what happens on a real world analog synth. It's just very difficult to get that pure tone without other frequencies popping in. And analog, since it's trying to model an actual analog synthesizer, it has those errors built into it. So the way this works is you start off with your oscillator, and we'll maybe pick a nice rich sound like the saw wave. I'm going to turn off everything quick. I need the amp on. Silly. I'm going to make this a little bit louder. So you start off by chipping away the frequencies of our waveform. Because if you think about it, if I'm going to play at this instrument, and this is my frequency spectrum, I'm really using a lot of that frequency spectrum with this one sound. It doesn't leave a lot of room for other sounds in my song. So a lot of times we want to kind of chip those away a little bit. So we can do that with the filter, where we're going to start taking away some of the actual frequencies of our sound. So we've got this knob here that controls our cutoff frequency, which is where we're cutting away frequencies. So if we look at this here, you'll watch as I bring this knob down, we start losing some of those high frequencies. Bring it back in. So we are subtracting frequency content out of this. We can bring the resonance up here to really hear that. The resonance gives us a little peak on that filter. Notice we have a little bit of envelope. We'll talk about that later. And by using this low pass filter, I'm cutting away those frequencies. We can do different types of filters. The next most common would be a high pass filter, which cuts away the low frequencies. So at this point, the only sound that's getting through is this super high stuff that we probably can't even really hear. I can't hear it in my headphones. But as I open that filter, we let the low frequencies in. And we can thin that sound out now. Another common filter would be the bandpass, which is it's basically cutting out highs and lows, and it's just letting a certain frequency range through. But the main ones you're going to see in most subtractive synthesis is the low pass and the high pass. I think I'm going to just stick to the low pass for right now. So once we've decided like how we want to chip away the frequency content, then we can think about the amplitude envelope. And that's this right here. So we have this sound now that we're hearing. It has a very quick attack. You'll notice like this is I'll explain this real quick. I'm going to make this linear just so it's really clear. This shape is the shape we're going to use to shape our sound. We're going to make the volume come through at this shape. If we think of the bottom here as time, this x-axis is time, and the y-axis is volume, over time, this is going to get to peak volume, which is right here. So that time is 626 milliseconds. Then it's going to decay down for another 620 milliseconds to this sustain level, which is half right now. 0.5 would be like half, 50% of its full volume. We could bring that all the way up. We could bring it all the way down. But the sustain level is the level of volume you will have as you hold down a note. So I'll just... Let me get that volume. I could actually... control the volume with the sustain there. And then the last one is release. So the release is how long the note takes to fade out after I let go of the key. Really short release, we get almost like an instant cutoff. Really short attack, we get an instant. So if I left it like this, I turned the frequency all the way up and I kept the envelopes all the way, opening up right away and closing right away, that's kind of like our pure block of granite that we have not shipped anything away from it yet. We can start maybe bringing out some of the frequencies here. And then maybe I'll have this sound fade in. And maybe I'll have it fade out slowly after I let go of the key. So we'll give it like about a second each. So we've trimmed off some of those sounds. We've cut away the frequencies and the volume. That basically is the principle of this type of synthesis. We're chipping stuff away. Now, it can get a little more complicated than that, though. I'm going to open my filter again, because what we can do is we can add a second oscillator. So I had my saw wave. Let's bring that attack. I'm going to bring everything kind of back to the initial status, the full block of granite. We can turn on our next oscillator. Now we've got two of these saw waves playing. And I can change the octave of this. So I can change the pitch. Add in a lower octave of the saw wave. So this is the same octave. Here's 2 octaves lower. And you can kind of see if we look at our readout here. I'll change the octaves. And you can see we start losing some of those low frequencies. And then I even add in some higher octaves. So we're layering in another oscillator. So we can tune it by the octave, but we can also tune it by semitones. So right now this would be like a 4th. We can make it like a 7th, which is a very strong interval, or 7 steps, which is a 5th, perfect 5th. We can even detune that by smaller amounts. So now it's the same exact sound, but as I detune this just a little bit, we get this kind of chorusing effect. The waves are not quite in tune, but it makes it sound a little bigger, a little wider. Maybe not wider, but it gives it a little more dimension, I guess. Creates this movement. You can actually see it all moving here, and my oscilloscope is kind of dancing around. I probably should have mentioned we can adjust the volume of each of these oscillators to mix them in together. So maybe I don't want this one quite as loud, so it doesn't have as much of that effect. And that would be handy if I'm, say, detuning it by maybe another octave. Fade that octave in. Fades in. Or if I had my 5ths, my perfect 5th. Sometimes just a little dash of that. So we can add in other oscillators at different tunings, which creates all kinds of possibilities. But it doesn't also have to be the same waveform. We could add in a sine wave. And you can hear the difference in that low part of the sound. This kind of buzzy here. It's a little softer this way. You can add in a square. The octave up. we can also add in noise. Maybe we turn that down a little bit. And it just kind of gives our sound a little bit of like a fuzz to it. Analog has its own dedicated noise oscillator, so you don't need to waste one of your two oscillators on noise. Turn that back up. You can just turn on the noise oscillator. I'll turn both of these off maybe. And we get a nice noise, which we can kind of change the, this is a color. And if I do this, it almost sounds like an ocean or something. These are like some techniques people use with synthesis to like recreate natural sounds. So if I bring these back in, maybe I just want a little bit of noise. And then we start doing our principles of cutting out frequencies, changing the envelope here for the volume. Maybe we'll give this a nice long fade in and a nice long fade out to sort of create like a pad sound. I'm getting a little bit too much volume here. It might be smart of me to lower the amp volume because I was getting into the red here. If I'll do that again, you can kind of see as I hold down more and more notes, we do get some red in there. And we don't want to be clipping anything, so we'll just lower the volume there a little bit. How are we doing so far? Is everyone with me? Any questions, or should I slow down, speed up, or go over anything in more detail?
Sounding good.
So far, so good. Cool, doing well. All right, pace is great. Good to hear. Nice. All right, so once we've like chipped things away, we can start adding some movement to this. We can start modulating or changing some of these parameters. Maybe well, I'll stick in analog now for a few more minutes. We've got LFOs. Now, you know what? I'm not even going to go to LFOs yet. First, I'm going to go to envelopes. So our filter has an envelope, and that's it right here. This shape here is, we can apply this shape to our filter, and the concept is very similar. This axis, the y-axis, would be our frequencies. This is our lowest frequency, and this is our highest frequency up here, and this is the time. Now the sustain level would be wherever we have our knob, wherever that knob happens to be. So if I have my envelope, which this says frequency modulation, I can now turn up the envelope. I'm going to turn it all the way up to its max of 16, so it's going to really affect this, because I want you to hear it happen. We're going to get our filter is going to start all the way open, all the way here. And over the course of, let's make it like 3 seconds, it's going to come down to this level here. So now let me fix our envelope here so we can actually hear this happen. And then we get that movement there. And I'm going to make this linear just so the curve is a little more obvious. And that movement happens. It's changing the filter based on the shape of the envelope. We could have this do kind of a fade in too. So it'll start lower at a lower frequency, go up to wherever my knob is, and then come all the way down. And it should come back down. There we go. So we got some movement there. We're moving our filter based on this envelope. We can then, you know what? Let me switch. I'm going to switch here, just to show you like all these concepts are similar. Let me turn some of this stuff off. This is an instrument I was working on with my Berkeley class today. It is a sampler instrument with samples of my voice. So I can right click here and I can show you the sample here. And here's the other one. Ooh. We'll do an ooh. So there I got this sample and this ooh sample. This one I'm going to turn off for a minute. It's not that important. This is actually just some talking and gibberish that I mixed in. We got these two samples. Now, instead of oscillators like we had in analog or operator where we had the waveforms, we're going to use the sample as the oscillator. If you look in at the sample real close, it really just is a waveform, just a more complicated waveform. That's what my voice looks like. That's what I think that was the ah sound. If I look at the ooh sound, it might look a little bit different. A little bit different. Make this a little bit bigger with this knob here. So those are two different vowels. That's just how they look, but they're essentially waveforms, and we can use those to make our synthesizer sounds. I'm going to turn off our filter. The same type of thing we had in the analog. I'm going to bring our volume envelope to be basically at its kind of like initial form, and we can hear what this sounds like. So those are two of my voices pitched out. You can see this is going through these samples like a waveform would be oscillating. But we can start doing some of those things we did before. So once we know our synthesis concepts, we can turn on our filter. Turn that off for a second. And we can filter out some of the sound. We can go to our volume envelope here and maybe have this fade in like a pad and have a nice long decay. A little bit longer. We can then turn on our filter envelope. And this one goes up to 72 for whatever reason. The other one goes up to 16. This one's 72, but this is the amount I'm allowing this filter envelope to control this filter here. So over the course of 4.5 seconds, this filter is going to start out all the way open and then drop down to whatever level I have it. So let me just bring the attack down a little bit so we can hear this. If I have the attack going slow, we don't really hear the movement of the filter. And where's my frequency? So we can watch this happen on the spectrum of the EQ. That's moving down. That's the filter closing down. So we're applying this concept of the envelope now to shape the tonality or the frequencies. Sampler has other envelopes too, like a pitch envelope, which we can use to affect the pitch of the sound. So since we have it at 0 steps, it's not going to do anything. But if I put this up to make it real drastic, like an octave, and I make it happen over the course of like 3 seconds, we get that note starts out higher, and then over 3 seconds, it drops down in accordance to the shape of this envelope. If I were to extend the attack, it's going to go up to an octave and then come back down to where we started. And that's because the pitch is now being tracked with this envelope. And I'll turn that off. And the next modulator that you might have on a synthesizer would be an LFO, which LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. So what the LFOs really are, they're just really low pitched oscillators. So if I go back to operator again and we look at our sine wave, I'm playing a fairly low C. It's coming in at about 130 hertz. If we look at this readout here, it tells us where it is, about 130 or so. And if I keep going down, it gets lower. This will be about probably 65, right? Because that's half of 130. And we make an even lower one, and that's going to be a little harder to hear, but around 32, 33. But once we start getting this low, it becomes harder and harder to hear things. I'm even an octave lower, and I don't hear anything in these little earbuds anymore. That's pretty much below what these things can put out, and it's at the edge of human hearing. But what the LFO is, it's so low that we just don't even hear it. We don't even hear it at all. So we can use this really slow moving waveform to modulate certain things in our sound. So I'm going to turn up the filter here, and maybe I'll turn off the filter envelope so we don't hear the two conflicting yet, because they'll both be affecting the filter at the same time. But we should have it now where if I play a note, and maybe I'll make it a little bit faster than that, we should hear the filter moving. We can actually see that happening here at this really slow rate. It's going down, up, down, up. And we can speed it up, make it go a little faster. And we can even do this synced to our tempo. So if I have like quarter notes, for instance, and I press play, it's in time with our music. We can make it go even faster, like 16th notes. That's keeping time with our music. And we can use the LFOs to affect a lot of different parameters. For instance, we could do pitch. Now we're moving our pitch around a lot. If we set the pitch at a low enough rate and then maybe a little bit faster, it starts to sound a little bit like vibrato. Whereas this is just kind of silly and ridiculous. Once you get around like 3 or so, it kind of starts to feel like vibrato. We can have an attack on our LFOs too, which is handy if you're trying to do vibrato. You can maybe have it fade in. So the effect of this LFO will fade in over 4 seconds. So I'm going to make this more immediate. You'll hear the note starts out very straight at first, and then it gets wobbly. And I'll just crank this up so you can hear it a little better. And that might be like a singer might sing. They kind of sing the note straight and then work their vibrato in, or a player might work that in slowly over time. You can kind of mimic that type of thing with the attack. We can use this to modulate the panning, which I don't know if you're going to hear on Zoom right now, so I'm not even going to bother, but we can do the volume of the sound. That creates a tremolo. Right now I've been using a sine wave, but we can change the waveform. We can make a square wave. So it's the sound now is completely on, then completely off. When I have a nice slow waveform, you can really hear that. Speed it up. Creates kind of this like stuttery sound. And there's other waveforms you can use. They have different kinds of characters to them. Now the volume is going down at this slope and up immediately. It creates almost like a plucking sound. random, which sort of randomly moves things. It's a little harder to hear on the volume, but the filter, you'll really notice it. Let me dial this back. So the filter is basically moving at all of these random positions. Turn up the resonance so you can hear it a little more. But every 1.24 hertz, it moves. Speed that up. Now it's all this kind of random craziness going on with our filter. A sampler has two other LFOs that give you some more possibilities of what you want to choose and what you want to assign them to. So they're kind of fun to play around with and try new things with. Let's see here. Where do you choose LFO? When do you choose LFO versus a long filter envelope? Okay, so that's the question. When do you choose LFOs versus filter envelopes? It's really your choice. The thing about an LFO is that it repeats. So this shape just keeps going. It keeps repeating. So if I want this like filter to just keep moving like that, I'll use the LFO. But if I just want it to kind of move once, I'd probably use the filter envelope. So this will now start out at the very open and then come down over the course of 4.5 seconds. So in general, the envelope just sort of goes through its cycle one time per note that you press. I'll play another note. That note will go through the cycle. But an LFO, I'll turn that off. An LFO will just kind of continue. I'll turn this off for now. We'll just continuously go. So this oscillator, you can almost imagine, is just constantly moving. It's just constantly running, just cycling through. And whenever I press a note, it just affects wherever it happens to be. You can change that behavior a little bit with retrig. Retrig will restart the shape of the envelope. I'm sorry, the shape of the LFO every time you press a new key. So if you notice, as I play multiple notes, each note gets its own LFO happening. They're not going together. So there's all this like kind of jittery thing happening. If I turn retrig off, they all move together. So everything's going at that same pace. But envelopes on certain devices, at least in live, have a looping function. So you can actually set these things to loop. And once you set it to loop, it sort of becomes like an LFO. It just repeats this shape instead of the shape of the oscillators. So it's, sort of depends on the job, what you're trying to do. Synthesis can start getting fun and exciting when you start combining these things. So now I've got my filter envelope on, I've got my LFO on. Maybe I'll slow this down a little bit so it's not quite as nuts. And I'll have this LFO fade in over the course of, let's say, 4.35 seconds. And this will I'll make this happen a little sooner. So this is going to go through its cycle. It's going to move the filter like that from high to low over the course of 2.5 seconds. And then after about 4.5 seconds, this will fade in to affect the filter. So you're going to hear like a kind of sound. To make that maybe not so drastic by lowering the filter amount so it doesn't move as far. We can have them both happen at the same time if we want. Let's make this happen a little slower. So as the filter is moving down, it's kind of going like this. Like that. So all of those same parameters we saw in analog are basically the same thing you see in sampler. The only difference really is that whereas in analog I'm using waveforms, in sampler I'm using samples. And that kind of brings me to wavetable, which is a whole other beast, I guess. Wavetable gives you waveforms of all different kinds, but you can morph between the waveforms. But if you look, we've got the same concepts. We start out with an oscillator. We have a filter down here. It actually has two filters. Right now, only one of them is turned on, but we could turn on the other one. Turn that off for now. Got a filter, and then we've got envelopes, and then we've got LFOs. So we've got our first oscillator here. It's a sine wave. And that sounds pretty similar to the one we had in analog and operator. But the cool thing about wavetable is you can morph between the oscillators. And since wavetable is so cool about modulation, as soon as I click on this oscillator position control, it pops up in this little modulation matrix. So this is the target or the thing we're modulating. And then these guys are all the different ways we can modulate it. So I can take that LFO1, which is right over here, and I can now use that to modulate the wave shape. Nice thing about wavetable is it's very visual. It lets you see what's happening. So I'm modulating that wave position with the LFO. We can bring it down, maybe start from here. We can change the rate of that LFO. And now you may have noticed when I click on LFO rate, that pops up in my modulation matrix. So I can now modulate the rate of LFO1. Maybe I can use LFO2 to modulate the rate of LFO1. So I'll turn that up a little bit. Maybe I'll slow this down a little, and we can watch as the rate slows down and speeds up, depending on how much I affect it. Bring this down a little bit. So now I'm using a modulator to modulate another modulator, which is where things can get pretty crazy. And wavetable lets you do so many different types of modulation. I can turn my filter, and I can apply that to, say, envelope 2, which is right here. So we can have maybe our filter is going to, we'll have this filter close over the course of 6.3 seconds. We can actually see that happen here, which is nice. The nice thing about wavetable is it actually shows you things moving. That filter's closing. I could even also modulate that like we did it in sampler with LFO1. And that's moving just like this in a way. I could do LFO2 also. And now again, all kinds of weird stuff start happening because there's all this interaction between our modulators. Wavetable goes pretty insane. You don't just get the basic shapes of waveforms. There's all kinds of different shapes you can use. And we got a whole other, there's all these categories of waves. Instruments. This is a piano wave, which is kind of neat. And that's just one oscillator I'm using. There's also Oscillator 2 to work in. It gets pretty wild pretty quick on wavetable, but the concepts are really the same. It's the idea that you have a sound source, an oscillator, and you are filtering out sounds. You have the volume that you can control with the envelope. You're trimming away volume over time. And then you are able to modulate any of those parameters using your LFOs or your envelopes. And that's really kind of the basics of, subtractive synthesis. It's kind of present. This is wavetable synthesis, but it's still present in there. We still have the principles of subtractive. And even if I went into operator and set us up into one of the different algorithms, which is now frequency modulation, and I don't know what I'm going to get here. Frequency modulation yields all kinds of crazy sounds. Kind of surprised that that's all it sounds like. I can just like tune these a little bit. So now I got this kind of metallic, interesting tone, but I then can go and filter out some of the sound. And I can use the envelope here, which has its control here. I can turn the percent up. And now this envelope will move over time. Maybe make that a little slower. So I'm using FM synthesis as my oscillators, which is a complicated thing that maybe is a good topic for another one of our live classes, FM synthesis. That's what the Sega Genesis sound chip is doing. If we talk about the pack that is out for everyone, the 16-bit pack, that is an FM synth chip. So that's why, like, maybe you might recognize the character of this like kind of metallic tone, the types of sounds you get with this Sega Genesis chip too, because it's the same type of synthesis. But once you get past the oscillator part, your filter, your envelope is all the same. So I think that's about it, really. That's the main idea here. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts or anything you want me to touch upon? Button said get into P waves. I'm not sure what you mean by that. The pulse waves, is that what we're talking about? I don't know if you can hear me or not. No, not sure. But if he is talking about pulse waves, we have that inside analog. Has the square wave is really what they call a pulse wave. When I'm going to turn off all these other things and bring everything kind of back to normalcy here. Do I have the envelopes? Let's turn that off. So I've got this square wave, which you can see here. It's shaped like a square. But we can change the width of it. So we get like a narrower square, which is kind of thin and nasally. Or we can make it a little wider. It gets like kind of hollow. So this is the pulse width we're modulating. I think we might actually be able to see that a little nicer on Wavetable if I go back to the basics, basic shapes. I think we can do this, can't we? Modulate the pulse width. Now I might have to come back to on that. I thought there was a way to do this. Pulse. Oh, here we go. So this is pulse width. So we can see we're changing the width of that square. It starts out kind of square down here. Oh, okay, I've got all this modulation going on. I can just turn these just down to 0. Double click on these just to get them away real quick. Or otherwise, I can just turn the amount down on this modulation matrix to 0. Bring our filter open. So we've got our pulse width. And this is pulse width modulation because I'm modulating the width of this pulse wave. On the Nintendo, the Nintendo sound chip, which is in the Super 8-bit pack, which I've got over here, that's that came with your downloads for this month too, the Super 8-bit pack. I can open up, say, this Nest Selector one right here. And this is allowing me to choose which waveform I'm using, the pulse or the triangle. There's 4 different pulse widths on the Nintendo. So this is the more narrow one. Now we're on the second. And then the final one. Whoop, right here. So the Nintendo doesn't have the smooth movement through the pulse wave that the wavetable has, because it's a 16-bit, I'm sorry, it's an 8-bit system, so it only lets you kind of go in steps. But yeah, that's what the Nintendo works off. And actually, if you look at this right here, the way I have this rack set up, we've got our oscillator we can choose, whichever pulse width we have. The Nintendo's only capable of those 4 pulse widths in the triangle. There's also a noise and sample channel, but as far as the tones go, we choose our oscillator. Then we can filter it out, the high frequencies. And then we can sculpt it using the envelope. We can give it a nice fade in and a long fade out, for instance. We could bring the sustain down and the decay, and then we got like a pluck. And those are the same concepts, really, that we're working with before. Oh, let's see. So I'm looking at the chat here. 1 through 9 frequency range, I feel like, in our bodies, earthquake range. Yeah, like some of these really low frequency ranges, when we're talking about like way down, even below what we can see on this EQ spectrum, these are things like that you feel. You know, their sound, if you think about sound, I found this really fascinating when I first heard it, that sound is almost like a complicated sense of touch. Like our hearing is like a sense of touch, really. All sound waves are changes in air pressure at certain speeds and rhythms and waves. And our ears have like these little hairs in them, and then we got our eardrum, which vibrates. That's how we hear the sound, through these like complicated like touch sensations within our ear based on the sound waves. But they need to be fast enough so that we can actually hear it, but not too fast, because once you get past 20,000 hertz, then it's out of our range of hearing. But we can feel the movement in the air, you know, from the sound waves. Like that's why when you maybe go to a club, or if you have a really nice sub speaker, you really feel the bass. It's all that low energy, just like going through your body. And I think that's a big reason why loud music is so exciting too. It's like, because you feel it. It's the actual wave is like going through your body, and it's just like an exciting feeling, really, of touch. I guess I missed the science joke in this chat. I don't know. Earthquake range, maybe. I don't know. I missed it. I'm talking too much. But yeah, I guess that's kind of it. I don't know. Any thoughts? Any questions from anyone?
Thanks, Brian. That's really interesting. I was just wondering, you've obviously got some hardware in the background there. How do you feel like what you can do in Ableton compares to your favorite piece of hardware synth which you use? And can you replace hardware with software? I guess it's a raging debate, but
Yeah.
interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, I would say that pretty much everything I can do with any of this hardware can be done inside of Live. It can be recreated. And the capabilities are, excuse me, much greater. I mean, if you take like a synth like Wavetable, I mean, I don't know of any hardware synth that has all of this kind of crazy stuff and all these modulation possibilities. And maybe if you're building your own modular setup, you can put all these components together and build something like that. But, you know, digital is the capabilities are so much greater. Um, that being said, I've obviously got some kind of problem here because there is a bunch of stuff that I like to play with. There's something nice about putting your hands on it, turning the knob. I mean, moving my mouse around to show you this is cool, but it's just doing this with my hand. It's the same movement I do to like write emails and do my taxes. I don't know. There's something fun about putting your hands on the knobs and like turning things and feeling it happen. I mean, you get that a lot with push. I love push, and even if it wasn't push, if it was MIDI mapping a keyboard, you get that hands-on thing, and it helps a lot. But kind of also too, like when we were looking at analog, and I mentioned like the sine wave, how it's not as pure. The sine wave is not as pure as the one inside of operator. We get all that extra stuff. These synths aren't as pure as this. They have their own kind of like attitudes and personalities. And some days, I mean, a lot of the newer ones are pretty stable right now. But they they're fun. I don't they do sound. There's something cool about the sound. There's like a power they have. I don't really know that, especially in a mix though. When you're mixing a track and you're putting stuff together, is it that big a deal? Uh, I don't know. I think that's debatable. I really do. Um, but it is certainly fun to like get your hands on those knobs and like feel it, like you're playing an instrument and it's this thing. And uh, so it's like it's a really hard thing to like defend to anyone that like
Yeah.
questions like how much money you've decided to spend on this thing that you already have in the computer.
Yeah, I'm
And
sure you could go on for a long time. I actually bought one of those Korg Minilog XDs for that reason, just to try and have a
nice.
bit more of a hands-on feeling. And I agree, it's quite fun to just be able to get away from your computer as well and just
Yeah.
kind of play around with that. And there's lots of different ways you can kind of even do live looping if you make the delay really long and just
Mhm.
experiment with kind of stuff like that. So
And that
yeah,
one has a sequencer too, right?
it does. Yeah, yeah,
Now, of course, like you have a much more robust sequencer inside of Live. You can do a lot more with it. But that system of working on the Minilog sequencer is pretty cool. The Prophet here has a sequencer on, and it's not like it's a lot easier. And sometimes I can get a lot more out of using MIDI clips, even sent to the Prophet. But using the sequencer is like a different way of working. It just feels different and it's kind of fun in its own way. And I would do things on that sequencer that I wouldn't do on the keyboard or I wouldn't do on a MIDI clip. So they do kind of force you to work differently too. And the computer, in my eyes, like the one downfall of it is that it's so limitless that there's kind of no boundaries. You can do anything. These things have
yeah, totally.
boundaries. Yeah, like I find that is like one of
Mm.
my biggest issues with working is that like what do I want to do now? What do I want to make? What kind of music? Which of these, just these synths I showed you today, they're all insanely powerful. Which one do I want to use? Which presets? Which I mean, you can really get lost in this stuff fast. So having like the gear, it does sort of box you in a little bit, and I think that's good a lot of times. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know how to defend it too well in words, but I know how it feels. Okay, so just seeing, all right, hardware and software sequences. That'd be cool. Yeah. So for some future chats, specific types of sound. Anything you're thinking of, Animus? Any specific sounds you were wondering about? I don't know. I would say this. It's as far as like when you're sculpting sounds with a synthesizer, is try to like ask yourself the questions like if I want to make like say like a bass sound, right? Like a electric guitar bass sound kind of. Like what does that sound look like over time? How does it start? Does it start off with lots of frequencies open in the beginning and then kind of close down? I think that would be kind of true with like a guitar. It's a very like it's a rich harmonic sound. It's not pure like the sine wave. Maybe I might start with something like a square. It's got more harmonics going. But it's not just like this. You kind of pluck the string and it's bright and then it gets duller over time. So maybe I might think about my filter and my envelope and it would start out bright and then like if I'm playing guitar chords, it kind of like dull out a little bit. They also don't last forever like this would, so I might have like some sort of decay over a certain amount of time. They're not always perfectly in tune, so maybe I'll bring in another oscillator and like detune it a little. I'm not saying this is an amazing guitar sound right off the bat here, but a little bit like a guitar, I guess. But then I might even like say, all right, well, if I'm trying to make a guitar sound, let's maybe go and grab like an amp simulation, like amp and cabinet. I don't know. Let's see what Crunch Default sounds like. A little bit, you know. Try a different sound. But I guess like what I'm trying to say is to think about the shape of the sound. And what is the shape of the sound? Like how does it change over time? How much frequency content does it have? Is it very heavy in the lows? Does it need the highs taken out? Where are we at? Synthesis. Oh yeah. So I'm glad you put that video in. I'll have to check that out myself. But I did want to. This is the video you put up, Chris. I would imagine.
Yeah, it's pretty retro. It's good though.
Oh,
It's
cool.
good
I like the
intro
retro
to
stuff.
synthesis.
I thought like for a real quick, brief page, this page by Roland is pretty nice. I'll put this in the chat. But if you really want to go into it, I love this site Ableton has called Learning Synthesis. It starts out with like it takes you through it really simply too, and then it goes into like this is volume, right? And we can change the volume. Then we got the pitch, and then it starts saying, all right, well now let's play around with pitch and volume at the same time. I know you can't hear this right now, but I don't even hear it honestly either. It's coming out of my interface, but it lets you hear like notes. Then you can play different pitches, and then it starts getting into like different faders for like the volume and then the brightness, which is sort of like your filter. And it just takes you through really nicely, step by step. I think it's really well done. By the time you get, I don't know if there's a menu. Yeah, there's a menu here. So you get the basics, but then it starts getting into like filters. Talks about filters in the real world. Like having a door closed is sort of like having a low pass filter where all the high frequencies are dull. But when you open the door, then you can hear the high frequencies, but mostly the bass stuff gets through. I think it's a cool thing to think about. It helps you with like mixing and EQing too. Like if you want to make something sound kind of distant, try cutting off some of the high frequencies. Those don't carry as well over distances. Maybe a little bit of reverb to like emulate like just the natural environment. And you know, like that concept, if you have a drum kit, anything, you know, oh, you know what drum kit I'll use? It's not available yet. But I'm working on a new pack that I made with a micro cassette. I'll let you guys. I'll just play this beat I have here. I recorded an 808 to a micro cassette tape. It's going to be a new free download one of these days. So let me take auto filter for a second. It's just a filter. If I want to make this sound kind of distant, maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll put like a little reverb on it. Now it sounds kind of like it's far away. If I put these guys into an audio effect rack, maybe I'll put my frequency on one knob and the reverb dry wet on the same knob. And what I'll just want to do is change the reverb to start at 100%. Yeah, like that. So as I turn this knob down, I'll be closing the filter and turning up the reverb. Now it's like kind of distant, kind of far away. It's like it's getting close. But a filter is really just EQ. That's all it is. So you can accomplish these things with an EQ. And just having an understanding of like these concepts in synthesis can help you with your mixing too. So yeah, it's all related, and like figuring out one thing sort of helps you figure out the other thing. It all comes together. But I would definitely encourage you guys to play around with like the different synths in live, and like now that if you weren't familiar with some of the aspects like envelopes, oscillators, and filters, to kind of notice them in different devices. Yeah, but I think that might do it for tonight, guys.
Thanks, Brian.
Hey,
Very interesting.
yeah, cool. And if there's any topics you want to go over in like future classes, chats, I don't know what to call these things. I've been calling them live classes lately. I like that better than Zoom meetings.
Yeah.
But whatever we want to call them, right? These like music production club things. Let me know, especially like in the Discord. We have like a live class thread. So if there's something you want to talk about, that would be great. You know, I could come up with ideas, but if it's stuff that will like immediately benefit you, I'd love to go into that too.
Sweet.
Cool.
Well, yeah, maybe even like different people sharing their own projects and sounds that they've made, possibly using any of your stuff would be cool as well.
I would love that. Like, I'm not trying to like say I have to lead this at all. You know, I'm happy we can just hang out and share music if you want to. I think that would be awesome, just to see what everyone's doing, you know, and get each other hearing your music. It'd be a cool way to just, you know, find out what other people are doing.
Yeah, what
might be something you really like.
I kind of had an idea to try and use your coin op thing to make like 3 tracks or something, and just use that as like a constraint to to not get distracted with all those things. But yeah, then I always get distracted and move on to something else most of the time. So hopefully it comes to something. But yeah.
I know that very well. Most of the projects on my computer are unfinished projects. They really are.
Great ideas, but yeah, to finish a song is quite challenging. Yeah.
I mean, that's like I was saying before, it's one of the problems, because I get excited. I want to try this thing. I want to try that. And then, you know, it's like there's just too many toys to play with.
Yeah.
But like,
yeah, true.
Using something like the coin op template to just get you stuck in a little way of working is really helpful. You know,
yeah.
I do find that the stuff that I finish and get done usually has some sort of some sort of limitation, some sort of box I put myself in, whether it's because that's
Yeah.
what the project is or just a decision I make. But
Mm.
the stuff that I come down as like this free spirit, let's see where it takes me, man. You know, I want to just ride the wave. That doesn't always
Yeah.
go anywhere.
No. Yeah, and yeah, there is so much to learn. Well,
Yeah.
thanks, and I'll keep in touch
Cool.
for the next one.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for hanging out, guys. And
I also just added another link there, but you probably don't need another project, but it looks like Ableton's developing some other learning materials and they're asking for feedback from educators. So
oh yeah, cool.
you can have a look at that as well if you're interested.
Awesome. I will. Thanks.
Sweet.
All right then. You guys have a great night.
Have a good night.
I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers.